The Intergalactic Mediation Bureau had all the efficiency of a three-legged panther trying to navigate a minefield while blindfolded, which, considering the current state of galactic diplomacy, was probably an insult to the panther. Dr. Helena Voss had been representing Earth in these delightful little gatherings for the better part of 3 years, and she'd developed what could charitably be called a professional appreciation for the absurd. The IMB's headquarters on Nexus Prime was a monument to bureaucratic excess, with 47 different species each insisting their particular brand of incompetence was the most sophisticated approach to interstellar relations. Today's peace negotiations involved the Kraxxon Empire, a collection of militant reptilians who'd apparently learned diplomacy from watching ancient gladiator matches, and the Ethereal Collective, a group of energy beings who communicated primarily through interpretive color changes and existential sighs. The fact that these two groups were trying to negotiate a trade agreement was roughly equivalent to asking a volcano to have a polite conversation with an iceberg. Helena sat at the crystalline conference table, her auburn hair pulled back in what had become her signature diplomatic bun, fingers steepled as she watched the Kraxxon delegate scales shift from aggressive crimson to homicidal maroon. The universal translator was working overtime, turning what she suspected were elaborate death threats into surprisingly flowery language about alternative solutions to resource allocation disputes. The Ethereal Collective's proposal for shared mining rights, the Kraxxon representative hissed, his name being something that sounded like rocks grinding in a blender, is an affront to the natural order of conquest and subjugation. The ethereal delegate pulsed a soft blue that the translator interpreted as, "We find your attachment to physical violence both quaint and deeply concerning." Helena had been through this dance before. The galaxy's younger species seemed to operate under the assumption that diplomacy was just warfare with more paperwork and slightly better catering. Earth had been part of the galactic community for barely a century, making them the new kids on the block in a neighborhood where some civilizations had been playing these games for millennia. Perhaps, Helena suggested, her voice carrying the particular brand of patience that came from dealing with toddlers who had access to planet-killing weapons, we could explore a compromise that addresses both parties' core concerns. The Kraxxon delegate's response was swift and decisive. The plasma blade that erupted from his ceremonial bracer was through Helena's chest before the security systems could even register the threat. She had just enough time to think that this was rather poor form, even by galactic standards, before everything went dark. The aftermath was remarkably civilized. The Kraxxon Empire issued a formal apology, claiming it was a cultural misunderstanding, and that their delegate had simply been emphasizing a point. The other species in attendance made appropriately shocked noises while secretly taking notes on human durability. Earth's response was a masterpiece of diplomatic restraint, a tersely worded note expressing disappointment and a request for better security measures at future meetings. What they didn't mention was that Helena was already being prepped for resurrection back on Earth. Death, as it turned out, was more of an inconvenience than a permanent condition when you had access to quantum consciousness storage and rapid deployment clone bodies. Humans had solved the mortality problem sometime in the late 22nd century, right around the time they'd figured out how to make coffee that didn't taste like recycled Starship fuel. 3 weeks later, Helena was back at the negotiation table, looking exactly as she had before her untimely demise, and displaying the kind of casual attitude toward assassination that made the other delegates deeply uncomfortable. She greeted everyone with the same professional warmth she'd always shown, as if getting murdered was just another Tuesday at the office. "Now then," she said, settling into her chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd just returned from a particularly restful vacation. "Where were we?" The Kraxxon delegate who'd killed her was conspicuously absent, having been recalled to face administrative review. His replacement, a younger Kraxxon with scales that shifted nervously between green and yellow, spent most of the session staring at Helena as if she might suddenly reveal herself to be some kind of vengeful spirit. The negotiations proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Funny how the threat of potentially unkillable humans could motivate even the most stubborn bureaucrats to find common ground. But the galaxy, as Helena had learned, was full of slow learners. 6 months later, she found herself in another set of negotiations, this time involving the Vorthak collective, a species that had apparently evolved from something resembling a cross between a praying mantis and a corporate middle manager. They had the charming habit of conducting business through elaborate ritual combat, except they'd never quite grasped that other species might not share their enthusiasm for potentially lethal business meetings. The Vorthak had been expanding aggressively into sectors claimed by the Luminous Federation, a group of crystalline beings who communicated through harmonic resonance and had about as much interest in physical conflict as a butterfly had in operating heavy machinery. The Federation had filed the appropriate complaints through the proper channels, which in galactic bureaucracy terms meant they'd be lucky to see a response sometime before the heat death of the universe. Helena's job was to mediate a solution that didn't involve the Vorthak eating the Federation's negotiating team. Literally. The Vorthak had some deeply unfortunate customs around victory celebrations. The disputed mining rights, Helena began, consulting her notes while carefully ignoring the way the lead Vorthak delegate was systematically sharpening his blade arms, could be resolved through a time-sharing arrangement that honors both species' territorial claims. The Vorthak delegate, whose name translated roughly to renders flesh from bone with artistic flourish, clicked his mandibles in what might have been amusement. The human speaks of sharing as if weakness were a virtue. The Vorthak way is simpler. The strong take what they will, the weak learn to endure. The Luminous Federation's representative chimed a note that sounded like wind through crystal caverns, which the translator rendered as, "We find your approach to resource allocation both primitive and unnecessarily violent." Helena had been expecting this. She'd studied the Vorthak's psychological profiles extensively, and they were exactly the kind of species that viewed diplomacy as a form of elaborate foreplay before the real business of conquest began. They respected strength, despised weakness, and had an unfortunate tendency to test both through direct application of violence. "Strength comes in many forms," Helena replied, her tone remaining professionally neutral, even as she noticed the way Render's Flesh was positioning himself for what was clearly going to be another demonstration of Vorthak diplomacy. "Perhaps we could explore what each party brings to the table." The blade that took off her head was admittedly impressive from a technical standpoint. Render's Flesh had clearly been practicing his technique, and Helena had to appreciate the craftsmanship, even as her consciousness uploaded to the emergency backup systems that Earth had installed in all their diplomatic facilities. Her body hit the conference table with a wet thud that sent the Luminous Federation delegate into a panic of discordant chimes. The other species present reacted with varying degrees of shock, horror, and what appeared to be professional interest. The Vorthak delegate cleaned his blade with ceremonial precision, clearly pleased with his work. "Now," he announced to the room, "we conduct business as civilized beings. The strong lead, the weak follow. This is the natural order." Earth's response was once again a model of diplomatic restraint. They issued a statement expressing regret over the unfortunate incident and requested that future negotiations include better security protocols. They also politely asked for Helena's body back, citing human burial customs, which the Vorthak graciously agreed to after removing a few choice organs as trophies. What they didn't mention was that Helena was already being grown in a fresh clone body, complete with all her memories and an updated tactical assessment of Vorthak bladework. Death was becoming something of a hobby for her, and she was developing strong opinions about the various techniques different species employed. The galaxy watched Earth's measured response with a mixture of confusion and contempt. Here was a species that had twice lost their primary diplomatic representative to what were essentially temper tantrums, and their response was to send strongly worded letters and request better table manners at future meetings. The Zephyrian Hegemony, a collection of avian species who'd built their entire civilization around the concept of aerial superiority and looking down on literally everyone else, decided that humans were clearly the weakest link in the galactic community. They began making plans. Helena's third assignment was supposed to be routine, a simple trade dispute between the Hegemony and the Aquatic Concord, over shipping routes through the nebula of perpetual storms. The Concorde were a peaceful species of amphibious scholars who'd discovered faster-than-light travel while trying to find better ways to preserve their libraries from flooding. The Hegemony wanted to use Concorde space as a shortcut for their merchant fleets, and the Concorde were politely declining on environmental grounds. The negotiations were held on a neutral station orbiting the nebula, with full galactic media coverage. The Hegemony had made sure of that, wanting maximum exposure for what they clearly saw as a demonstration of human weakness. Helena arrived at the station 3 days before the scheduled talks, using the time to review the case files and enjoy what passed for decent coffee in the Outer Rim territories. She'd developed a certain philosophical acceptance of her role as the galaxy's most expendable diplomat, and she was determined to at least enjoy the travel opportunities. The Hegemony's delegation arrived with considerable fanfare, their leader being a particularly impressive specimen named Skyrender Magnificent Plume of Victory over lesser species. He was approximately 8 feet tall, covered in iridescent feathers that shifted color with his emotional state, and possessed the kind of arrogance that could only come from a species that had never encountered anything they couldn't fly away from. "Ah," he said upon meeting Helena, his voice carrying the particular condescension that seemed to be a universal trait among species who considered themselves apex predators. "The human returns. I trust you've recovered from your recent educational experiences?" Helena smiled politely, the kind of expression that diplomats perfected for dealing with individuals who confused cruelty with intelligence. "I'm feeling quite well, thank you for asking. Shall we begin?" The negotiations proceeded exactly as Helena had expected. The Hegemony made increasingly unreasonable demands, the Concorde offered patient counterproposals, and everyone present could feel the tension building toward what was clearly going to be another demonstration of galactic diplomacy in action. Helena had been doing this long enough to recognize the signs. Skyrender's feathers were shifting toward the deep crimson that indicated hunting mode. His talons were extending in what he probably thought was a subtle threat display, and he'd been making increasingly pointed comments about human fragility. "The Hegemony grows tired of these pointless discussions," he announced, rising from his perch with the fluid grace of a natural predator. "Perhaps it is time to demonstrate the price of defying our will." The energy weapon that burned through Helena's chest was considerably more sophisticated than the crude blades she'd experienced previously. Skyrender had clearly invested in quality equipment for this particular demonstration. Helena had just enough time to appreciate the craftsmanship before the neural feedback overwhelmed her consciousness. But this time, the Hegemony had made a critical error. They'd arranged for full galactic media coverage, and Helena's assassination was broadcast live across 17 star systems. Skyrender posed over her body, his feathers now a brilliant gold that indicated supreme satisfaction, and delivered a speech about the natural order of species hierarchy that was probably meant to be inspiring, but came across as the kind of thing that belonged in a children's story about why bullies were bad. The galactic community watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as the Hegemony essentially declared war on humanity through the simple expedient of murdering their diplomat on live television. The betting pools that had sprung up around human durability crashed as everyone assumed this was finally the incident that would provoke a proper response. Earth's initial reaction was, once again, a masterpiece of diplomatic understatement. They issued a statement expressing deep concern over the escalation of tensions, and requested that all parties return to civilized discourse. They also politely asked for Helena's body back, citing the same burial customs they'd mentioned before. The Hegemony, now convinced that humans were the most pathetically weak species in the galaxy, agreed to return the body after taking a few choice feathers as trophies. They also began making plans for a full-scale invasion of human space, figuring that a species too weak to avenge their murdered diplomats would make excellent servants. What they didn't know was that Helena was already being grown in her 4th clone body, and that Earth's leadership had finally decided that the galaxy needed a practical demonstration of why humans preferred diplomacy over the alternatives. Captain Marcus Chen received his orders on a Tuesday, which seemed oddly appropriate for what was about to become the most educational week in galactic history. He was commanding the ECS Diplomatic Solution, a ship whose name was either ironic or prophetic depending on your perspective. The vessel was officially classified as a cultural exchange platform, which was the kind of bureaucratic euphemism that should have been a warning sign to anyone paying attention. Admiral Rei Nakamura's message was brief and to the point. The Hegemony has decided that humans are too weak to matter. Please demonstrate why this is incorrect. Rules of engagement. Whatever seems appropriate, try not to break anything we can't fix. Chen had been expecting this for years. Humanity had been playing the role of the galaxy's diplomatic pushovers for nearly a century, absorbing insults, tolerating aggression, and generally behaving like the kind of species that natural selection should have eliminated millennia ago. The fact that they'd survived, thrived, and quietly become one of the most technologically advanced civilizations in the galaxy should have been a hint that something was wrong with this picture. The thing about humans, Chen reflected as he reviewed the tactical data, was that they'd solved most of their existential problems sometime in the late 22nd century. Death was inconvenient but reversible, scarcity was a historical curiosity, and warfare had evolved from a necessity into an art form. When you had access to matter compilers, quantum consciousness storage, and weapons that could restructure reality at the subatomic level, the galaxy's primitive notions of strength and weakness became rather quaint. Earth's response to the Hegemony's aggression was swift, comprehensive, and utterly devastating in its restraint. They didn't destroy the Hegemony's worlds, didn't slaughter their population, and didn't even significantly damage their infrastructure. Instead, they did something far more cruel. They made the Hegemony irrelevant. The Hegemony's merchant fleets simply stopped working. Their ships would start up normally, achieve optimal cruising speed, and then quietly shut down their engines and drift. Their communication networks began broadcasting Earth's diplomatic proposals on continuous loop. Their weapons systems developed an unfortunate tendency to fire confetti instead of lethal energy beams. Their economy collapsed within a week, not through violence or destruction, but through the simple expedient of every piece of technology they depended on developing a quirky sense of humor. Their proudest warships began playing human music instead of responding to tactical commands. Their automated defense systems started offering visiting ships coffee and directions to the nearest diplomatic facility. The Vorthak, who'd been making plans to follow the Hegemony's example, quietly cancelled their expansion into human space and sent a very polite note requesting trade agreements. The Kraxxon Empire, not to be outdone in diplomatic innovation, offered to name a moon after Helena and establish a scholarship program for human diplomatic students. Helena's fourth body was completed just in time for the Hegemony's formal surrender. She arrived at the signing ceremony aboard the Diplomatic Solution, which had been revealed to be one of humanity's more modest technological achievements. The ship's translation systems had been upgraded to communicate in pure sarcasm, and its defensive systems consisted primarily of making enemy weapons feel guilty about their life choices. Skyring magnificent, plume of victory over lesser species, was no longer quite so magnificent. His feathers had gone a dull grey that indicated profound depression, and his talons had been replaced with ceremonial signing implements. He approached Helena with the kind of respectful terror usually reserved for natural disasters or tax auditors. "The Hegemony," he said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who'd recently discovered that their entire worldview was built on a foundation of wishful thinking, "wishes to express its profound regret for the recent misunderstandings." Helena smiled with the kind of professional warmth that had become her trademark. "Misunderstandings happen. The important thing is that we found a way to move forward constructively." The signing ceremony was broadcast across the same 17 star systems that had witnessed Helena's assassination. The galactic community watched in fascination as the Hegemony formally agreed to a treaty that essentially made them a human protectorate in all but name. They would maintain their independence, their culture, and their dignity, but they would do so under the watchful eye of a species that had demonstrated the difference between patience and weakness. The treaty included several interesting provisions, The Hegemony would provide security for human diplomatic missions, ensuring that future negotiations proceeded without unnecessary violence. They would also establish a cultural exchange program, allowing young Hegemony citizens to study human methods of conflict resolution. Most importantly, they would serve as a practical example to other species about the potential consequences of mistaking diplomatic restraint for weakness. As the ceremony concluded, Helena found herself reflecting on the curious nature of galactic politics. The universe was full of species that had mastered the art of violence, but had never quite grasped the more sophisticated forms of power. They understood strength in terms of claws and fangs and energy weapons, but they'd never encountered a civilization that had moved beyond such primitive approaches to problem-solving. Humans had learned through centuries of trial and error that the most effective way to deal with aggressive neighbors was not to destroy them but to make them into allies. Sometimes this required demonstration of superior capability, but the goal was always integration rather than elimination. The galaxy's younger species would learn this lesson eventually, or they would find themselves in the same position as the Hegemony, proud, independent, and utterly dependent on human goodwill for their continued relevance. The diplomatic solution departed from the signing ceremony with its mission complete. The galaxy's power structure had been quietly but permanently altered, not through conquest or destruction, but through a simple demonstration that humans were not in fact the weakest link in the galactic community. They were the most dangerous, precisely because they were the most restrained. Helena returned to her quarters and began preparing for her next assignment. The Crystalline Collective had been making some rather pointed comments about human territorial claims, and she suspected that another educational experience might be in order. She made a note to update her will and ensure that her clone backups were current. Death might be inconvenient, but it was excellent for making diplomatic points. The galaxy settled into a new equilibrium, with most species developing a sudden and profound respect for human diplomatic customs. The Intergalactic Mediation Bureau actually began functioning with something approaching efficiency, largely because no one wanted to be the next species to discover what happened when humans ran out of patience. And somewhere in the depths of space, Admiral Nakamura was already planning humanity's next lesson in galactic civics. The universe was a big place, full of species that had yet to learn the fundamental truth about human nature. They were not weak because they chose diplomacy over warfare. They chose diplomacy because they were so terrifyingly good at warfare that it had become boring. The galaxy would learn this lesson eventually. Some species would learn it through observation and careful study, others would learn it through direct experience. But they would all learn it because humans had finally decided that it was time for the universe to grow up. Helena Voss, diplomat, murder victim and inadvertent teacher, smiled as she reviewed the files for her next assignment. The galaxy was full of slow learners, but she was nothing if not patient. After all, she had all the time in the world.